When does the unforgivable become justifiable? That's the question we'll be grappling with in this grisly tale of vengeance and violence on the American frontier. Let me just apologize ahead of time here. I will be breaking a lot of the rules of historiography in this video. Namely, I will be presenting events from very selective points of view to make you sympathize with the people that I want you to sympathize with. Everything I'm going to tell you really happened. The history is accurate, just subjective. But just be forewarned that starting in just a few moments, I am going to be manipulating you. Are you ready? Good. 3, 2, 1. After their victory over the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett in King Philip's War of 1675-76, the Puritan colonies of New England experienced a decade of exponential growth and radical change. New towns were founded, new immigrants arrived, business boomed, especially maritime trade. This far-flung English outpost at the edge of the world was quickly maturing into a bustling economic powerhouse. In 1688, the 9 Years' War began in Europe, pretty much just because King Louis XIV wanted the borders of France to be just a little bit bigger. France would bring the war to North America the following year when Louis de Bois, the Comte de Frontenac, governor of New France, with its capital in Quebec City, would order attacks on commercial and civilian targets in New England and New York. The subsequent cooperation of these English colonies, riven by cultural and religious differences, demonstrates just how much this region had changed in the previous 10 years. During King Philip's War, the New England colonies had been left to fend for themselves against a determined native enemy. On one occasion, Sir Edmund Andros, then governor of New York, had actually threatened to invade Connecticut to press a land claim there. But now, in this new conflict, which came to be known as King William's War, New York and the New England colonies worked in tandem to counter the French threat, together with their allies in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, commonly called the Iroquois, who had been fighting New France for domination of the lucrative fur trade for nearly a century. But the French had native friends too, the recently formed Wabanaki Confederacy, which encompassed a multitude of native nations over a huge swath of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Acadia. And throughout the war, New Englanders on the frontier lived in constant fear of the Franco-Wabanaki raiding parties, who they knew were haunting the forests in the vast wilderness between the lobster coast of Maine and the St. Lawrence River. French expansionist strategies and Wabanaki hit-and-run tactics proved to be a terrifying and formidable combination. In the first major raid of the war, Dover, New Hampshire was destroyed, with 23 of its citizens slaughtered and 29 carried off into captivity. Later that summer, French and Wabanaki forces captured an important fort at Pemaquid on the coast of Maine. The following year, they capitalized on that victory by storming Fort Loyal on the site of present-day Portland, effectively wiping more than 50 miles of New England frontier off the map. After the capture of Fort Loyal, the French promptly broke the terms of surrender by indiscriminately murdering English prisoners, the majority of whom they handed off to the Wabanaki to be taken as captives. 200 English died at that siege, an absurdly high casualty rate considering the small scale of 17th century North American warfare. More raids and massacres followed on the frontier, and it seemed like the French and the Indians were getting ever bolder with every passing year. Finally, in 1697, as the war was drawing to a close in other theaters, the Wabanaki threat had reached as far south as Haverhill in Massachusetts. On the dismal morning of March 15th, 1697, a simple brickmaker in Haverhill named Thomas Dustin was going about his morning chores when he saw 20 Wabanaki warriors heading straight for his house, where his children slept, along with his wife, who was just recovering from delivering their 8th child only 6 days before. It was a frontiersman's worst nightmare, unfolding before Thomas's very eyes. He galloped home as fast as his horse would take him. Finding 7 of his children outside, he was faced with an agonizing decision. There wasn't enough time to get his children to safety and go back inside and rescue his wife, who was still sleeping with the newborn. In that split second, he chose his kids, shepherding them to the safety of the nearby woods while the Wabanaki fell upon the house. Thomas's wife, Hannah Dustin, probably woke to the sound of musketry as the Wabanaki fired after Thomas and the older children. Moments later, the door slammed open and native warriors poured inside the house. Also inside was Mary Neff, a neighbor of the Dustins who was staying with the family to help take care of the baby. Mary tried to get away with the newborn, but the warriors captured her almost immediately. Meanwhile, they dragged Hannah out of bed, robbed her, and then pulled her out into the cold as they set the house on fire. Hannah, Mary, and the baby were prodded over to the 6 other English captives under guard and ordered to start walking. Perhaps on their way out of town and into the wilderness to the north, Hannah passed by a few of the 27 corpses that the Wabanaki had made of the English at Haverhill. If so, it's highly likely that she recognized every pallid, staring face. It was bitterly cold. The terrain was rough. There was probably still snow on the ground, and the Wabanaki insisted that the captives keep up a smart pace. And the baby wouldn't stop squalling. One warrior had had enough, or maybe he reckoned that the baby wouldn't survive very long in those conditions anyway. In any event, to the women's horror, he wrenched it out of Mary's hands and dashed its brains out on the trunk of a tree. The forced march continued for weeks as the party followed the Merrimack River north. Along the way, English captives began to tire or fall out of the column, whereupon Wabanaki warriors would dispatch them with a tomahawk to the skull. Soon, the English women were claimed by new masters, a Catholic Penacook family of 2 men, 3 women, and 7 children, who marched alongside the warriors. Also with the family was another captive, a 14-year-old boy from Worcester, Massachusetts, named Samuel Leonardson. The family forbade Hannah and Mary from their Protestant prayers. One of them told Hannah that he had actually been a praying Indian in Massachusetts, in the congregation of Reverend Joseph Rawlinson. The man told Hannah that he thought the English way of praying was good, but that the French way was better. Hannah and Mary were also informed that they were headed to a large village to the north where they'd be forced to run the gauntlet, an elaborate form of torture where prisoners were made to run between 2 columns of warriors who would continually beat them with clubs. A month and a half into the journey, the party camped on an island at the confluence of the Merrimack and Contoocook rivers. There, Hannah convinced Mary and Samuel to join her in an escape attempt. They waited until their captors were asleep, and then stole 3 of their hatchets. In the dead of night, the 3 English positioned themselves over the snoring family. They raised their hatchets and took careful aim for the heads. Then, at Hannah's signal, brought them down in a furious rain of blows. It was butchery. They killed 10 Indians in all. Only 2 escaped, a badly wounded woman and a boy who they had intended to spare anyway. Hannah then scalped all 10 bodies. Gathering the hair in a bundle, they hopped in a canoe and began to paddle south. It took them 9 days to get back to Haverhill. There, Hannah was reunited with her family. She was grieving, malnourished, traumatized, but very much alive. Three, 2, 1. In most histories of King Philip's War, the Native American side of the story is monopolized by the 3 big nations who fought against the English: the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett. But there were other native groups that played a smaller role in the conflict, with their own stories of that turbulent time. Among these more obscure tribes were the Penacook people of southern New Hampshire. When the Puritans of the Great Migration established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s, the Penacook sachem Passaconaway began a lifelong policy of appeasement toward these strange foreigners from across the sea. His heir Wanalancet ascended to the throne sometime in the 1660s, and he continued this policy. In the summer of 1675, King Philip's War broke out, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony began to get very nervous about Wanalancet's intentions, especially since strange Indians had been seen threatening towns south of the Merrimack River. But these warriors were definitely Nipmuc, not Penacook, because in point of fact, by this time, Wanalancet had led his people prematurely north to his winter capital near the site of present-day Concord, New Hampshire, just to get as far away from the war as he possibly could. However, the move raised the suspicions of the notorious Massachusetts Bay militia captain Samuel Mosley, who had been assigned to reinforce the Merrimack River settlements. And this guy, I swear to fucking God, this fucking guy, whenever New Englanders mistreat Indians, this guy is always fucking there. So in September, Mosley ordered a preemptive strike on the Penacook's winter capital. Wanalancet ordered his warriors to stand down and allow Mosley to burn their wigwams and destroy their winter stores. And he still did not retaliate. By hook or by crook, Wanalancet was going to preserve his neutrality, so he led his people even further north, to the headwaters of the Connecticut River, and the Penacook sat out much of the war in these northern regions. When they finally returned to the lower Merrimack, they found that a year of home front war had made the English hateful and mistrustful. So Wanalancet renewed his pledge to keep the peace by signing a treaty with the English at Dover, New Hampshire, under the watchful eye of an English tradesman and militia officer named Major Richard Waldron. The war in southern New England ended just a couple months later, but peace did not bring stability for the Native Americans of the region, and the Penacook soon found themselves in the midst of a full-blown refugee crisis, as non-combatant Indians from the destroyed nations surged north and west, desperately trying to escape English rangers and slave catchers. The Penacook took a bunch of these refugees in, as was the custom among northeastern woodland native nations at this time. But soon the English got wind of this, and generally it made them very nervous when neutral nations took in refugees from hostile ones. In fact, that was their whole justification for their attack that destroyed the Narragansett back in December of 1675. So in September of 1676, Major Waldron invited Wanalancet to a big feast outside of his house in Dover. It was very much an open invitation, and hundreds of Penacook ended up coming. Now, you will sometimes hear a version of this story that states that it was a militia drill meant to recruit Penacook soldiers into service for the English, but this is contradicted by Waldron's own testimony in a letter to the Massachusetts Council dated September 6th. That's it right there, which unambiguously states that it was a big dinner. He also states that there were only about 80 men of fighting age in attendance, with about 20 muskets between them, the rest being about 250 women and children. In the midst of the feast, which probably involved copious amounts of alcohol, Waldron sprang his trap. English militiamen sprang out of hiding and rounded up the terrified natives at sword point. A few Narragansett and Nipmuc refugees were found among them, but the vast majority were, of course, friendly Penacooks. In flagrant violation of the peace treaty Waldron had signed just 2 months earlier, most of the natives captured at Dover were sent in chains to Boston to, quote, determine their case, which for most meant a noose on the common or a lifetime of backbreaking labor on a Barbados sugar plantation. We don't know exactly what happened to Wanalancet at this point, but he disappears from the historical record. In all likelihood, he met a dismal end, swinging from a scaffold. He was the last sachem of the Penacook. What remained of their people after the betrayal at Dover fled north, where they were absorbed into the Abenaki nations of the mountains of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Nations that would, in just a few short years, reorganize into the powerful Wabanaki Confederacy. Which brings us to King William's War. If the 10-year interbellum had made the colonies more cosmopolitan, it also made the native groups of the region more politically centralized. While a far cry from French-style absolutism, the level of cooperation among these nations as gigantic confederacies was basically unheard of before this period. The Abenaki, the main ethnic and linguistic group of the Wabanaki, had actually fought in King Philip's War too, and their war against the English had lasted a full 2 years longer than the Wampanoags. And what's more, they won. The Abenaki put so much pressure on the main frontier that the English were forced to abandon all their settlements north of the Saco River. And in April of 1678, the Penobscot sachem Mokawando actually was able to force the English to sign a treaty which agreed to respect native land rights. But neither side expected the peace to hold for very long. The formation of the Wabanaki Confederacy as a united military polity attests to that, as does their increasing cooperation with New France. Quebecois missionaries and tradesmen had been courting the Wabanaki for decades, and the relationship between these two groups was exceptionally strong, far stronger than that between the English and the Haudenosaunee. Some French even lived among the Wabanaki as one of their own, such as Mokawando's own son-in-law, Jean-Vincent d'Abbadie, the Baron de Saint-Castin. Saint-Castin would be a war leader in King Philip's War and go on to be an important sachem in King William's. The French certainly had their own colonial ambitions, and at least at the administrative level thought of the Wabanaki as more of a means to an end than anything else. But unlike the English, they had ingratiated themselves in the indigenous socio-political fabric. They had adopted the customs and mores of North America rather than cling to those of Europe. The result was that this alliance was less of a superior and subordinate type of relationship and more of a collaboration among peers. And while King William's War was instigated by New France, decisions of direct strategic command were made by the Wabanaki, as is evidenced by their choice of targets. Something that many European chroniclers at the time did not appreciate was that the Algonquin way of war was highly pre-planned and narrow in its focus. The best word I could use to describe it would be surgical. Native brutality could be extreme, but it was never indiscriminate. Targets were chosen to avenge a wrong of the past or achieve a specific strategic goal, which is why in June of 1689, a Wabanaki force co-led by the Penacook warrior Kenkamangus descended on Dover, New Hampshire. Dover was chosen as the first target of the new war for a very good reason, and that reason's name was Major Richard Waldron. The evening of the attack was rainy, which covered the Wabanaki's approach. Waldron was taken completely by surprise as warriors, almost certainly relatives of those Waldron had betrayed, burst into his room and rushed forward. Waldron barely had enough time to get out of bed and grab his sword before he was fighting for his life, but he was quickly overpowered, and the warriors tied him to a chair. In mocking reference to Waldron's civilian profession as a traitor, the warriors dragged their knives over his belly, and as they did so, each said, "I cross out my account." After a lengthy torture, they impaled him with his own sword. Subsequent Wabanaki attacks unfolded in a similar way. What the English saw as indiscriminate slaughter was in fact a highly targeted and systematic campaign of retribution. And as long as they were striking fear in the hearts of the English, the French were perfectly content to let the Wabanaki just do their thing. The Penacook were not the only band of King Philip's War refugees taken in by the Wabanaki. The Apikwaukee people of the Saco River watershed in Maine were a large part of the fighting force in the battles at Pemaquid and Fort Loyal. Many of these native warriors who burned English homes and murdered English civilians were attacking towns that stood on their ancestral homelands. Many of them had been born and spent their childhoods in these places before being displaced by the English, whether by force or through exploitative land sales. Now, we don't know 100% for sure whether the warriors who attacked Haverhill in March of 1697 were Penacook, but there is good reason to think so, given that Haverhill is built on Penacook land. And the family who held Hannah Dustin and Mary Neff captive were almost certainly Penacook from northeastern Massachusetts, especially given the mention of Joseph Rawlinson, whose congregants in Lancaster, Massachusetts were mainly of Nashaway, Nipmuc, and Penacook extraction. So imagine it was you. Imagine your people did everything that they possibly could to avoid war with the English, only for them to betray you in the worst way possible. Then imagine all of your family and friends, in fact, most of the people you've ever met in your life, carted off to be enslaved and executed. And now, 20 years later, you're marching back to the place where you were born, only now it's been taken over by your worst enemies. But this time, you're facing the English with a gun in your hand and hardened warriors at your back. How many of you can honestly say that you wouldn't hack and slash your way through that town like the goddamn angel of death? And some of you might be thinking, sure, I'd probably want to kill those people. But their kids? No. Smashing a baby's head against a tree? Fuck no. No matter how consumed by revenge I was, I would never stoop that low. You might be right. You might also be dead wrong. I don't think that anybody can really know what they would do in that situation unless they were in it. And you know, there is reason to believe that the native brutality in this story has been greatly exaggerated. The only detailed primary source we have describing Hannah Dustin's escape is from famous Boston theologian Cotton Mather, who heard the story from Dustin herself. Mather's account forms the basis of all subsequent retellings of the story, including the one you heard earlier in this video. Mather published his rendition of the story pretty much unaltered 3 times. This passage is from his book Magnalia, Christi, Americana, an ecclesiastical history of New England in the 17th century. In this particular part, he describes how the Penacook murdered English captives for seemingly no reason. Ere they had gone many steps, they dashed out the brains of the infant against a tree, and several of the other captives, as they began to tire in their sad journey, were soon sent unto their long home. The savages would presently bury their hatchets in their brains, and leave their carcasses on the ground for the birds and beasts to feed upon. If you know anything about native warfare in this period, then this passage doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The taking of captives was an extremely important part of native raiding, and after European diseases decimated native populations, it became absolutely essential to the survival of many Indian polities. Sometimes nations would go to war specifically for the purpose of taking captives, to eventually incorporate them into their community and swell their numbers. In King William's War, many captives were also taken up to Quebec to be traded to the French, but this was probably not the Penacook family's intention, at least according to Mather, who states, "This Indian family was now travelling with these two captive women, and an English yacht taken from Worcester a year and a half before, unto a rendezvous of savages, which they call a town somewhere beyond Penacook. And they still told this poor women that when they came to this town they must be stripped, and scourged, and run the gauntlet through the whole army of Indians. They said this was the fashion when the captives first came to a town." If the final destination was an Abenaki town, then it stands to reason that the plan was to try to force or convince these prisoners to switch sides. But either way, these captives were of great value to the warriors. Killing them for no reason would be as out of character for the Algonquin as it would be for Mark Zuckerberg to respect our privacy. Also, it's worth noting that women never ran the gauntlet, as far as we know. It was a test reserved for male captives to see if they were tough enough to join the nation as a warrior. The same logic applies to the infanticide, but I'm more inclined to believe that happened because of the Algonquin practice of mercy killing, which is definitely a misnomer. I mean, there's no nice way to kill someone who doesn't want to die. It was more of a practical measure than a compassionate one. It was typically done to captives too badly hurt or sick to travel long distances, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that it would be done to a vulnerable newborn baby at the outset of a midwinter trek across hundreds of miles of Appalachian terrain. Nonetheless, a lot of this story just does not add up. If we're to take Mather and Dustin's word on this, then the only logical conclusion we can draw is that this particular war party was both especially cruel and especially stupid. And hey, that's a reasonable possibility. I mean, what's the alternate explanation? That Hannah Dustin murdered an entire family of 10 people, 6 of them children, simply to escape? That seems like overkill, literally. I mean, wouldn't she just need to kill the 2 fighting men? Maybe not even that. I mean, it was the dead of night. She could have just stolen everybody's weapons and slipped off. But even if she was understandably just so enraged by the murder of her baby that she just went postal and tried to murder everybody, then what possible reason would she have to waste valuable time staying behind to take all of their scalps? Well, when you look at what happened when Hannah returned home, a possible motive reveals itself. Cutting off the scalps of the 10 wretches, they came off, and received 50 pounds from the General Assembly of the province as a recompense of their action. Besides which, they received many presents of congratulation from their more private friends, but none gave them a greater taste of bounty than Colonel Nicholson, the governor of Maryland, who ere another action sent him a very generous token of his favour. £50. Wow, that's a lot of dough. About $10,000 in today's money. Presents of congratulation. That sounds nice. A generous token from the governor of Maryland. Ooh la la. Oof. Fancy schmancy. Turns out Hannah was a bit of a celebrity after her return. I mean, the fact that she was rubbing shoulders with the great Cotton Mather only a few days later goes to show it. Not bad for a country girl whose father was imprisoned for witchcraft in the Salem trials. Oh yeah, that happened. He was a bit of a sketchy guy, too, a faith healer with a reputation for dishonesty. And her sister was hanged as an infanticide on Boston Common. That's some family gossip. Maybe there was some mental illness in the family. I don't know. I mean, it couldn't have been a great home environment growing up. Maybe Hannah was the sort of girl who might be prone to scalping 10 people, 6 of them children, for no real good reason. And one more thing, the Dustins didn't exactly get that cash reward unprompted. Thomas Dustin had to apply for it. And this is interesting, the practice of paying a bounty for Indian scalps had actually been discontinued a couple months before this incident. But the General Assembly thought that they should make an exception, just for Hannah, Mary, and Samuel, and they were each awarded with significant amounts of money. So Hannah had a vested material interest in making her killings seem justified, i.e. by painting the Wabanaki in the worst light possible, spinning horrific yarns of torture and torment, possibly even turning the natural death of her baby on a hard winter's march into a horrific scene of cold-blooded murder. By taking the native perspective into account and critically analyzing our primary source, we come to a stark hypothesis: that Hannah Dustin killed a bunch of kids for money and attention. Cheers. So, which version of the story was right? Which act of violence was justified? Well, both. And neither. And that's kind of the point, right? There were no good guys in the cycle of violence of 17th century New England. Just people hurt, people scared, people doing unspeakable things. The fact is, like most events in history, we will never know exactly what happened between Hannah Dustin and her Penacook captors. The story, as told by Mather, is without a doubt extremely fishy, and personally I am highly skeptical that that is how it went down. But even if Hannah Dustin was an opportunist and a liar who killed in cold blood, that doesn't make the attack on Haverhill any less shocking and terrifying from the English perspective. I mean, Hannah didn't know she was living on Penacook land. She didn't know about the intricacies of native warfare. To her, it was just, oh fuck, armed men are at my door and they're coming for my kids. I also find some renditions of this story, as told by historians sympathetic to the native plight, to be a bit confusing, and while well-intentioned, the conclusions that they draw can be a bit of a stretch. One blog post I came across online said that the Wabanaki would have treated Hannah and Mary as potential family, which, no, I don't know how this person was raised, but in my family growing up, we did not kidnap each other against our will. And of course, the Native Americans were always victims and could do no wrong narrative is highly problematic in general. I find it quite patronizing, to be honest. It deprives Native people of agency, and most importantly, infringes upon the inalienable right to be badass. Think about Richard Waldron's death, right? I mean, the Penacook getting revenge on the man who destroyed their nation through treachery by torturing him to death while delivering sick one-liners is so fucking metal, and all people deserve the chance to be able to dispatch loathsome enemies in fucking dope-ass ways. Sadly, indigenous people never seem to get that chance. I mean, if it were Vikings torturing to death some asshole who deserved it, people would think it was fucking awesome. But all of a sudden, when it's Native Americans, we're clutching pearls and we're going, see, they were brutal and bloody and violent, not like those woke historians at those commie universities will tell you. And that's the other side of the coin, right? The people who are often loudest about saying we shouldn't judge historical people by modern standards always rush to defend the Hannah Dustins of the world, but almost never extend the same courtesy to people like the Penacook, which makes me think that they aren't nearly as concerned with historical integrity as they are with winning the culture war of modern American politics. For the record, I don't think we should pass judgment on these people, and I think we should try to understand all the perspectives involved in any given historical event, especially the messy ones like this. But in any event, I think the question is flawed. Let's not ask, should we judge historical people? Let's ask, should we empathize with historical people? And to my mind, the answer to that question is always a resounding yes.